The Thing and the 1986 version of The Fly are considered perhaps the two greatest science fiction horror movies ever made, as well as two of the best remakes of all time. Because, while individual opinions may vary as far as the four movies go, very few would deny that both remakes are objectively better films. Though, as many have been quick to point out, said remakes are so different from the originals that in many ways it's not really fair or right to compare them to each other. But, somewhat unfortunately, that hasn't stopped many from doing just that, and both The Thing from Another World and the 1958 version of The Fly's reputations have suffered because of it. However, what's interesting to note is that The Thing from Another World has actually suffered this to a much lesser extent than the original version of The Fly. And today, I'd like to go over all the different reasons why The Thing from Another World's reputation wasn't as badly impacted by its remake as The Fly's ultimately was. And needless to say, there will be spoilers for all four movies ahead. So in case you've been meaning to watch one of them yet but haven't, you should probably come back to this video another day. I won't be giving out any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so the first thing that should probably be noted about these two respective films in relation to their remakes is when they were made. Because in the 1950s, when both The Thing from Another World and The Fly were made, they were very limited in what they could do, both in terms of special effects and how much violence and gore they could depict. And not to mention, both science fiction and horror were seen as B genres in the 50s, so it was a lot harder to get audiences to take them seriously. And this was something that both remakes had a leg up on, with advancements in bringing monsters to life, and that they could get away with showing as much gore as they wanted to. In fact, it was noted that the limited nature of special effects hindered The Thing from Another World in particular, as the more out there ideas the writers had for the alien had to be scrapped both because they were deemed impossible with the technology available and because they also had a tight budget to work with. And it was mainly for this reason that the alien was instead depicted as a vegetable vampire rather than a shapeshifter, because it was more practical and cost-effective. And while that wasn't as much of an issue with the original version of The Fly, an idea still had to be scrapped where the fly head would have been a much more grotesque mixture of fly and human anatomy, both because it would have been too hard to accomplish and because the Hays Code would have never allowed it. So what's my point with all of this? That both these remakes already had major advantages over the originals from the word go, and combined with excellent, top-notch writing, it was only a given that they would be seen as superior. But then the question must be asked, if censorship and effects were a problem for both movies, why is The Thing from Another World more well regarded than The Fly, especially when it arguably suffered from these problems to a greater extent? And several reasons can be put forth, with one of the most notable being that The Thing from Another World is often remembered for its better qualities, while the original Fly movie is more remembered for its lesser ones. In other words, when one thinks of The Thing from Another World, they'll often remember the extremely effective jump scares, the use of the Geiger counter to convey the alien's presence, the famous, and extremely dangerous to film, scene of them trying to kill the alien by setting it on fire, the death of the alien, and especially the iconic final lines. So while the movie has flaws, and most will admit that, it's more well known for what it got right rather than what it did wrong. With The Fly, however, all anybody ever seems to talk about in regards to it is the infamous "help me" scene and endlessly debate over whether or not the high-pitched voice makes it unintentionally funny. And if anything else is to come up, it'll usually be people criticizing the depiction of Andre with the fly head as not being a very good effect. To put it simply, one movie is still given respect by most people in spite of its superior remake, while the other has had a much harder time regaining the praise and recognition it once had. And another major, though overlooked, reason for this is how the movie's respective remakes treat the original. Because The Thing respects The Thing from Another World, while the 1986 version of The Fly doesn't respect its predecessor. And if you don't believe me on that, just look at what John Carpenter and David Cronenberg had to say on the movies they went on to remake. Because simply put, Carpenter loved The Thing from Another World. He even said it was one of his inspirations to become a film director. He even used it as the basis for Halloween. And because of that, he not only pays several homages to the original film, but he never acts like his version is superior to it, even though it arguably is and had several advantages over it. And because of that respect for the original, it makes people more inclined to judge and appreciate The Thing from Another World based on its own merits divorced from its remake, because that's what John Carpenter himself did. But it's not the same story with David Cronenberg. Because according to him, he was inspired to remake The Fly when he was a kid, because he found watching the original unbelievable and said he wanted a story that would, quote, make a scientist proud. In other words, even as a child, he didn't like the original Fly movie, and thus treats his film from the get-go as if it's better because, by his logic, it's more realistic. And it arguably is better, don't get me wrong. I think the 1986 version of The Fly is a masterpiece and that David Cronenberg is a genius that few others can match. But there's also more to the story than Cronenberg makes it out to be. Because first of all, Cronenberg's logic relies on the fact that a teleporter that can only teleport one being at a time would genetically splice two beings together rather than get their atoms scrambled in real life. But the thing is, teleporters don't exist in the real world, and quite possibly never will. So as a result, it's impossible to know what would actually happen in the scenario that both movies suggest. Because in all likelihood, it would all depend on how the teleporter was built that would determine how it would react. What I'm trying to say here is, because the story concerns technology that doesn't exist, there's nothing to realistically determine which version would actually play out, if indeed either one would be what would actually happen. So as a result, it's kind of big of Cronenberg to just automatically assume that what's shown in the 1958 version of The Fly couldn't happen, when it's honestly just as likely to as what he presents in the remake. Really, one could say that the most unrealistic thing about the original is that Andre survives the accident. But then again, the same could easily be said about Seth as well. And speaking of which, despite wanting to make Seth's whole transformation as true to life as possible, there are a few things about it that are just as logically questionable. For example, for becoming a half-human, half-fly hybrid, Seth gains an awful lot of traits from the fly and retains very few of his human ones. Like, why does he eat exactly like a fly would? Sure, it makes for a great weapon, but would it really happen that way? Or his wall crawling ability? Because as many have pointed out, in real life, Seth would be too heavy to actually be able to do that. But it comes in awful handy as far as the story goes, doesn't it? And there's also the fact that once the transformation is finally complete, his face almost perfectly resembles a fly's with very few human traits left. But if he's a 50-50 mixture of the two, shouldn't he retain more of his human features than that? Why does he gain all the facial appendages of a fly, but loses most of his human ones? Really, the hands and feet are much more realistic in this regard, because they actually look like a genuine 50-50 combination of human and insect. Now, as I said before, and contrary to what this might look like, I think Cronenberg's movie is a masterpiece and have nothing but respect for the man, but I'm just trying to apply his logic of the original movie to his own, and it should be pretty obvious by now, it's not one that holds up too well. Especially because he was applying that logic to technology that doesn't even exist, and thus had no way to prove that his interpretation of it is in any way true, while all of my arguments are based on more factual logic. But again, my point here isn't to argue why Cronenberg's movie is secretly bad. Not at all. I'm just trying to show how criticism like that can often tear down great stories even when the logic behind that criticism is extremely flawed. Because as I went on at length about in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, while obviously not on par with its remake, the 1958 version of The Fly is actually a really good movie, especially for a horror film from the 50s. Because if anything, it subverts almost everything that the genre was known for at the time. It's very intelligently written, with something important to say, uses its scares very sparingly, and not to mention is very effective in those scares when they are used, and perhaps most surprisingly, the titular monster never hurts anyone. Seriously, this may be the only monster movie in existence where a human is mutated and still has enough brains left to destroy himself before he hurts himself or anybody else. As I just pointed out, this is probably one of the most unconventional and smartly written horror movies out there, especially by the standards of the 1950s, and it almost never gets proper credit for that. And this is especially true for the theme of the movie, which is man's obsession with progress and how one must be extremely careful in their pursuit of it, lest there be terrible consequences, which Andre learns at the cost of his life. And in a day and age where advancements in technology are happening so fast most can barely keep up with it, what this movie had to say is more relevant than ever. But, as I already got into in the aforementioned video, most will never even know that about the movie because it always gets compared unfavorably to its remake. And once again, Cronenberg's own opinion and lack of respect for it doesn't do it any favors in this department either. But if there was anything else to be pointed out about these two movies, it's that if either of them was justified in getting a remake, it was The Thing from Another World. Because few might know it, but both The Fly and The Thing from Another World were actually adaptations of short stories, The Fly and Who Goes There, respectively. And the original version of The Fly is actually a pretty faithful retelling of the short story, with the biggest deviation being that the studio wanted a happy ending, so the infamous "help me" scene was added, both for that reason and for one last scare, as well as a generally more optimistic ending centered around the theme of progress. But otherwise, it's an extremely faithful adaptation. The Thing from Another World, however, borrows very little from Who Goes There, beyond a bunch of Arctic researchers coming across an alien and it terrorizing them once it's accidentally thawed. As I already said before, a lack of budget and censorship resulted in the story being turned into a more typical monster movie of its era than the book was, with the science behind the alien as well as trying to figure out how to kill it being its main focus. Really, the only thing The Thing from Another World faithfully takes from Who Goes There that The Thing doesn't is the main characters finding and thawing the alien themselves. To put it simply, The Thing was much more justified in being made because it was an opportunity to tell a more accurate version of the short story. Because again, The Thing from Another World took the story of a stranded Arctic crew being killed off by a shape-shifting alien and turned it into a movie about them trying to kill a vegetable vampire from outer space before it kills them. Though, granted, it still tells that story way better than it had any right to. But the point is, The Thing takes everything the short story had to offer and realizes it to its fullest potential, essentially becoming everything its predecessor couldn't be. Honestly, when you really look at it, the fact that The Thing went out of its way to homage, respect, and not step on the toes of The Thing from Another World is both very notable and commendable. With The Fly, on the other hand, the original had already faithfully recreated the short story, and even went the extra mile of creating its most iconic scene all on its own. So in many ways, remaking it was much less warranted, and only happened pretty much because the studio and David Cronenberg wanted it to. Now sure, the results were a masterpiece, but once again, the lack of respect for the original in the remake was pretty undeserved, especially because it was always meant to be an adaptation of the short story. And the teleporter, the man and the fly swapping a head and arm, and Andre's death are all lifted directly from the original short story and weren't made up for the movie. So to sum it all up, while both The Thing from Another World and the original version of The Fly have superior remakes and were held back because of the era they were made in, one still has a much easier time getting respect than the other, and a major reason for that comes down to how their respective remakes treated and respected them. Because at the end of the day, the 1958 version of The Fly is just as good as The Thing from Another World, having some extremely smart, relevant themes and messages, and is overall just very well made. But because The Thing respected its predecessor where The Fly did not, it has a much harder time getting recognition. Now, of course, there are other factors for this as well, such as a few I brought up before, but that still has more to do with it than most people realize. Because as I explained before, the fact that The Thing respects The Thing from Another World, one finds it easier to separate the earlier movie from its successor. But because Cronenberg touted his movie as superior to the original from the get-go, it makes most of the unfavorable comparisons drawn between them inevitable. But at the same time, it was Cronenberg's right to make a remake, and he was under no obligation to try and prop up the original. As I said before, I'm not trying to blame him for the arguably skewed reputation of the original movie. Just that it arguably deserves to be more praised and recognized than it is, and should be thought of more in the same vein as The Thing from Another World, which can't compare to his remake, but is still most definitely appreciated for what it is instead of what it isn't. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Why do you think The Thing from Another World is more well regarded than the 1958 version of The Fly, especially when stacked up against their respective remakes? And do you believe that said remakes' respect or lack thereof for the original had anything to do with it, or not? However you feel, please let me know in the comments below. And let me just please once again reiterate that I am in no way promoting any hatred for David Cronenberg or his approach to the Fly remake. My only issue was with his logic surrounding certain aspects of the original movie, and have absolutely no issues with the man himself. As I said before, I have nothing but great respect for him and regard him as a true genius. And please also keep in mind that you are also entitled to your own opinion on this subject. And if you think I was wrong about everything I said, that is perfectly okay too. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.